raised. Now, Strauss does not believe in the resurrection, but he knows the disciples did, and the swoon doesn't get you from A to B. You get this kind of Jesus. Lord, come on in. Get a chair. Get a pail of water. Call the doctor. To paraphrase Strauss, the disciples would have gotten a doctor before they proclaimed him risen, because here's Peter over in the corner saying, oh boy, someday I'm going to have a resurrection body just like his. And that, by the way, is the proclamation that's most tied to the resurrection of Jesus, that believers will be raised. Now again, Strauss doesn't think believers are going to be raised, and he doesn't think there's a guard, and he doesn't think that Jesus was raised. But if you can't get that belief on the disciples' part, it doesn't work. And the problem is, swoon can't account for the experiences that the disciples had that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus.
In addition, the second major fact which historians must evaluate is the empty tomb.
The majority of scholars who have written on this subject agree that the tomb of Jesus was probably found empty by a group of his women followers early on Sunday morning. That represents the historical core of the empty tomb narrative as we find it in Mark. Secondly, I think that the empty tomb story is also multiply and independently attested in early sources.
The empty tomb was preached very early. You've got Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 saying, he died, he was buried, what went down is what came out, and what came out is what appeared.
Why is that solid evidence?
Well, because critics, if you're using this methodology that says we'll use the facts critics admit and facts which are well attested, Paul is admitted to be an eyewitness. The book in which his testimony appears is already early, about 25 years after the cross, but then the creedal passage that he reports of that early tradition from verses 3 and following, 1 Corinthians 15, is earlier still. And in Galatians 1 and 2, he's got apostolic confirmation of his message from Peter and James in Galatians 1, Peter, James, and John in Galatians 2. So you've got this intricate, interwoven, an accredited eyewitness messenger with an early book, with an even earlier creed, and it's teaching our fact here in question, the empty tomb.
Further, there is one final piece of evidence that proves Jesus' tomb was empty. The Jewish leaders themselves testified to this fact.
The earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection was not to point to the occupied tomb, but rather to say that the disciples had stolen the body. It was itself an attempt to explain away why the body was missing. So that we have here evidence from the very enemies of the earliest Christian movement in favor of the empty tomb. Evidence which is simply top drawer because it comes not from the Christians, but from the very opponents of the early Christian movement.
The historical evidence shows Jesus was crucified on a cross. His body was laid in a tomb that was cut out of solid rock. And 3 days later, that tomb was found empty. So what happened to Jesus' body? We will turn to that question next.
Coming up, we'll explore the resurrection of Jesus. What proof do we have that this event actually occurred?
For the Jew, the resurrection was an event that took place in space and time, in history. And therefore, something more is needed than just hallucinations of the dead man to explain why they came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, rather than merely his translation into heaven.
We'll also look at the rise of Christianity when Jesus, the Search Continues, returns.